Right. All right. What's up, everybody? My name is Langston Clark. As Dr. Cervantes mentioned earlier, I am an associate professor at UTSA. And what I'm going to be doing for you all is just describing the conceptual history and foundations for how we go from cultural competence or cultural competency to culturally sustaining approaches and pedagogies for kinesiology students. I want to thank you all for your graciousness in allowing me not to be there today. We had some family travel that we had to get done, so I wasn't able to be there in person, but I will try my best to give you a good explanation now. So let me go ahead and share my screen. And so way back in the day, in the 1970s, when we were in the midst of integrating and diversifying higher ed, the workplace, the marketplace, all of those different things, out of K through 12 education came multicultural education, an idea founded by James Banks. And one of the criticisms of multicultural education that led to culturally relevant and culturally responsive pedagogy was that things began to become very superficial, and that we weren't necessarily attending to students' diverse cultural needs as much as we were just superficially adding diverse students, multicultural students, images, and maybe sometimes their stories into the curriculum. And so from culturally relevant and responsive pedagogy came cultural sustainment, which took ideas of relevance and responsiveness to another level. And so one of the things that I want to impress upon you all is that cultural relevance and responsiveness goes from this idea of just being additive to transforming the way that we do education, and having its roots in the work of Gloria Ladson-Billings and Geneva Gay in the mid and early 90s. There is very much an influence from Black feminist perspectives or Black women's perspective. And one of the things I want to make sure that we are attending to or aware of is that cultural relevance and responsiveness in some ways may be watered down right now, where we're just talking about students' culture and ignoring their academic achievement. But in the research done by Ladson-Billings, she intentionally sought out educators who had great outcomes for students. And what she found is that those educators of Black children who had great academic outcomes were very good at appreciating and attending to the cultural identity of Black children in schools, such that the type of education that they were getting, the type of pedagogy that the teachers were using, aroused in students a social political awareness. But I would even say beyond just an awareness, it was action, right? And so students were working on projects where they noticed some inequity in their community, and then they had to write a letter to local politicians and policymakers in order to fix those issues. It really was a type of pedagogy that, one, spurned academic achievement, but was rooted in the context and the identity and the culture of the students in an actionable way, right? And so when we think about education or great ways to teach, we want to give students an authentic learning experience where they're actually doing something and going beyond just theoretical tropes in a sterile scientific environment. We want what we do to matter, okay? And, we fast forward about 20 years or so, 20, 25 years. And as we all know, in scholarship, we always have to start producing new ideas. And so for Paris and Alim, the ideas of culturally appropriate, culturally responsive, and culturally relevant weren't enough to push schools and push the way that we teach forward in an effective way for diverse and multicultural students. And so I'm going to read this out because I think it's important to really hone in on this definition that's given by Paris, where he says that the term culturally sustaining requires that our pedagogies be more than responsive of or relevant to the cultural experiences and practices of young people. It requires that they support young people in sustaining their cultural and linguistic competence of their communities while simultaneously offering access to dominant cultural competence. For Paris and Aline, it's not just enough for students to be able to navigate or maintain who they are where they are. It's also important for students to be able to maintain who they are while they're navigating the mainstream or dominant cultural competence, right? And so culturally sustaining even attends to the shortcomings of multiculturalism, in that it's supportive of multilingualism in multiculturalism in a way that perpetuates and fosters, or let's say sustains, cultural pluralism as a democratic project in schooling. So what does that mean? What that means is that, as I think about this in the context of kinesiology, right, kinesiology has a culture. It has a disciplinary culture. It has a disciplinary language. It's a shared technical language. Right? And so how do we get our students, how do I get our educators, our kinesiology educators in higher ed to maintain who they are culturally and linguistically while also becoming competent kinesiologists? So I'm not training my students to be PE teachers to give them a foundation for their work. If they want to be occupational therapists, they want to be physical therapists, or decide to get their PhDs and become doctorates in kinesiology, I'm not just preparing them to become kinesiologists. I'm also preparing them to be who they are as they become kinesiologists, if that makes sense. And so what I believe is the next iteration of this, or maybe just a different iteration of this, is what I call a post-PWI approach to cultural sustainment. You know, all of the scholars that have been mentioned before, Banks, Geneva Gay, Latson Billings, Aleem, and Paris, the one thing that they all have in common, even though their approaches to educating from multicultural education to cultural sustainment, although they're all evolutions and they're different, and some of them are critiques of what happened in the past, they all come from predominantly white institutions of education. And so what does cultural sustainment look like at a Houston-Tillotson University where Dr. Cervantes works? Houston-Tillotson University is an HBCU with a large Hispanic population, or an HSI like UTSA where I work, where, you know, we are in a context where our students are having to navigate the dominant educational environment, a predominantly white educational cultural environment in the same way. And so much like we see in cultural relevance and cultural sustainment, that we are preparing our students to go into their own community. But there's also this interesting caveat that our approach to cultural sustainment and cultural relevance is not one that's seeking to prepare white folks to go into communities of color so that they can know how to sustain students of color in their pedagogy. This is an entire context that is historically Black or Hispanic serving, where it's embedded in the culture of the institution to do those things, right? One of the things that I explicitly witnessed in my research related to this was an approach to teaching kinesiology where students were told, taught, and trained that I'm preparing you to go back to your own community. I'm preparing you to go build up your community. And we're not preparing you to go survive through the microaggressions that you might see in a different context. We're not preparing you to go advocate for diversity and inclusion in an environment that wasn't made for you. We're encouraging you to go back to your own community and build it up, so that you can make where you come from a better place for you. And so, as much as preparing our students to be role models for their community, to be servants of their community, we're also preparing them to be actors in their community. How do you leverage your education in kinesiology to build programs that encourage physical activity, healthy approaches to living and lifestyles where you live, that close the gap between resources, all of those different things, so that our students are able to go back to their own community and build it up, and not just survive through a predominantly white environment or a dominant cultural environment for learning and working. And what we're doing is we're preparing them to go beyond being just examples and role models, but to be actors and agents in their own communities for the uplift not only of themselves, but for the folks around them. And so as we move forward, I'll let Dr. Cervantes kind of talk about the actual approaches that he uses in his classroom context for that. And again, I thank you all for having me, and I appreciate your grace in allowing me to join you without actually being there in person.